So now there's API calls. API calls is the same idea as the workflow instances logs, but you can query and search by API endpoint on the API endpoint level. So what that means is you have to select the app that you first want to search. So I want to search BigCommerce, and then you have to select the endpoint that you want to search as well. So I believe we had a, oh, this is a wrong BigCommerce. I believe we had a get customers version 2.1. And then you can specify the date range as well. I'm just going to keep it to a week and then submit. And then it gives you all of the instances for the API endpoint as well. So these were the 4 times that the API endpoint has ran. And then a very useful thing is if you press this button here, it opens up the API endpoint. But then also what you can do is if you go to, let's see, oh, I'm trying to find a specific instance of an API call. You can use API calls. And how can I query for an even specific API call? You would press the down caret or down arrow again, and then it gives you some options as well. It gives you the option to query for the status, if it was successful or failed, a call type. So this would be like, was it part of a workflow step? Was it just a test that you ran on the app level? Was this a trigger? Or was this a trigger test, meaning you manually launched it and you tested the trigger manually? You can also select the method, like is it a get, post, put, delete, patch, or any of these methods as well. And then it gives you 3 fields. So it gives you, you can search by the response body. You can search by the endpoint path. So like, the path that you're going. And then the request params as well. So this is very useful because say, for example, you don't know, like you have like that, maybe thousands and thousands of workflow instances that ran, right? But you want a specific one that responded with the data of Jim, right? Then you can pass in Jim here and then press submit. And then it seems like it was still the same. These 4 instances, and that comes back with Jim. You can do the same thing with request params. So say, for example, the get customers version 2.1 doesn't have any request params. If you remember, the get customers 2.1 just doesn't have any. But let's try to add one, like a fake one, and just to show you what this looks like. So I'll run this, test, it failed, right? Because that's not a correct request params. But then what I can do now is I can come here and then I can search for test, and then it'll give me that failed instance because this is what it's searching for in this request params here.
Okay.
So there's a lot of different ways you can search. Basically, request params, you can search anything from what the API calls request params are. The response body, you can search for anything that comes back from the response body. And then the endpoint path, you can search by the path of the endpoint as well.
Okay.
Does that kind of make sense?
Yes.
Cool. All right. So that's basically workflow logs. Any questions on workflow logs before we kind of move on?
If I want to find this that you run you recently that have the test, this don't work in a workflow. So you need to like filter that in that chain that you told me that is like if it is in workflow or is it running like manuals.
I would say just don't add that filter if you're not sure, because it'll still return all of it. Within the workflow, if you do make the change and it runs within the workflow, it will still show up on the API. One last thing, which I forgot, which is a good tool, is going to be in the options. So going back to the unsuccessful instance, say that this has errored out, but say that this wasn't an unauthorized issue, but you just passed in the wrong data in the request params.
Okay.
Say, I wasn't supposed to add the level 4 and level 8, for example. Like these were wrong. What you can do is most of the times there's scenarios, right, where if there is an error, you will want to change the workflow to accommodate the error. But a lot of the times what can happen is this could be a one-off edge case, right? The customer put something in there that they shouldn't have, they made a mistake, and it's just a one-time, mistake that the customer made. But we shouldn't necessarily change the workflow to accommodate for one-off mistake, right? If that makes sense. In those cases, what we can do is we have this button called modify.
Yeah.
And what that does is bring up this window to modify the API call in that step.
Okay.
So it gives you all the options that you have and say that these two were incorrect. So we just need to delete those. What we can do is we can run that specific step that it failed on with the new data that you just modified with. So you can modify the payload and the workflow here, or the endpoint here, press submit. And then what it will do is it will retry that endpoint with the new data. The reason why it failed again is because, the errors that were unauthorized. But you can see in the request params, our payload has changed. So this modify is more of like a one-off, you would only use it when like, okay, the customer just made a mistake, or I just need to send this payload in with the correct information. I don't want to make a change on the workflow level, but just, on this specific API call, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Cool. Any questions on the modify button? And this modify button is only available for API calls. So you can't modify the request params inside of a function and then rerun that. If there's an issue with the function, you always have to make the change on the workflow level and then relaunch it, or manually launch it, or resume it, depending on what the change is. But this option for modify will be only available within the API calls.
Okay. When you change that, it's going to affect the rest of code that you did before?
Yes. What's going to happen is this will basically, so if this worked, this will show that it was successful instead. And then it will run through, and if the workflow was successful, then the status would change to success.
So if you test another, I don't know, you choose another for launch and do the test, and you change this, it's going to affect also that new that you are testing?
Let me give you another example
Yeah.
and kind of show you what I'm talking about. So let's go to, so basically what you're asking is, if you modify that step within a for each, or like a for loop, would it like keep going and affect the rest of the loop, or right?
Yes, and the rest of, yes, like it's going to impact, I guess, from the other parts and the other example that you create before.
Right. So it will not affect anything that has already ran
Okay.
on the above steps of the workflow. it will only affect anything below it. So if you modify it and submit it, and it kind of resumes the workflow with the new data, if the data has to be caught, or there's something like in a step above it that needed to happen correctly for the rest of the workflow to still run correctly, then it will never change that above step. So in that case, you would have to, go to the workflow, make some modifications and relaunch the whole thing. The modify really only gives you the option to change the information and do a resume, if that makes sense. Like, you're basically only changing that one step and then letting it resume or run that step so that it can just move on with the rest of the workflow.
Okay.
So if it's in a for each, and say that there's 5 things in the for each, and then it errored out on the second one, if you modify and resume it, it will go through now the 3rd, 4th, and 5th one inside of the for each. But it won't change the first one, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yes, okay.
It's kind of like having a breakpoint and then resuming it after changing stuff from the breakpoint, but yeah, gives you that option when the API call has failed.
But I guess it's not so common, right? Because
it would be pretty common, yes. So there's a fine line between should I make the change on the workflow level, and then should I be able to modify the payload and just send it in? And like I was saying, if this is something that would come up a lot, you should make the change on the workflow level so that maybe build a custom function to accommodate for it, or change some of the mapping so that it doesn't happen again. The modify would only be if like it was a mistake, or the customer knows that it's supposed to be a different field or something like that for the specific case. Then that's when you would use that.
Okay. Great, thank you.